everyone to today's Tech Talk, the top 10 actions to take in your team's migration. And this is a very timely topic given we're at the start of a new calendar year. We know that many of you customers and partners joining us today live or watching the recording will be part of many migrations and tenant consolidations as we approached the 2024 year, whether they're related to M&A, mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, or even just other digital transformation or modernization projects. So we're really excited about today's topic. We have two fantastic speakers that have spoken at TEC and on Tech Talks before, so you might know them already very well. If you don't, you'll get to know them over the course of the next hour. Before we bring Randy and Sophia, our presenters, in, let's dive into some housekeeping. This is going to be recorded, so that recording will be available on quest.com shortly after the session. This is a Teams meeting, and we want to make this interactive. Part of the tech experience, the Tech Talk experience, is giving you guys access and ability to answer your technical questions and get really practical insights and answers. So please use the chat function to ask questions. We have two migration experts in the background while Sophia and Randy are presenting that will answer your questions in the chat. We can also bring back some of those relevant questions and talk about them live if we have time, as time permits. So we have Steve Texera and Craig Baldwin, again, in the background, ready to answer your questions. So make sure to type them into the chat throughout the presentation. Now, before we go any further, let's just turn it over to our presenters, Sophia Perez and Randy Rempel, to do some introductions and get into the session.
Thanks, Dan. Let me get this going. All right, so I just wanted to introduce myself real quick. My name is Sophia Perez. I've been with Quest for a good number of years, probably 5. Before that, I was a part of a company called Metalogics. If people on this call have been in the collaboration space for a while, you guys have probably heard about that technology. And basically right now I'm focusing on migration projects, as well as some management and DLP security stuff around Office 365 and various workloads of Office 365. And Randy and I have been working together for a while on presenting topics like this to the audiences like you guys.
Right, so I'm Randy Rempel. I'm a principal product manager. I've been with Quest now. It's my second time for about 5 years, and I've been in IT for quite a while. I focus on basically content migration products, including Teams migrations, and I have a number of certifications. So I'm a big believer in always just staying educated, and I have a couple of degrees too. So it's just something that I always try to focus on, and I'm really looking forward to presenting on this topic today.
Thank you, Randy. So I would like to jump right in. Like we said before, we're going to cover 10 steps that we think you guys can benefit from if you're looking at a Teams migration project somewhere in the future. Maybe that's what's going on as we speak. And first of all, I just wanted to talk about Teams for a second, right? At this point, it's safe to say that Teams is the leading collaboration platform in the world today. It has a pretty impressive number of 300+ million daily active users, which basically equates to 4% of the population of planet Earth logging onto Teams every day. It's pretty crazy if you think about it that way. Now, functionality-wise, Teams basically is a Swiss Army knife when it comes to collaboration within the company or even outside of the company. And with Teams, users get access to things like conversations, meetings, channels, calls, live events, just to name a few. And all of it is conveniently integrated into the familiar Office toolkit. Now, Teams are known to be quite complex and multi-layered. Now, let's take a look at why that is the case. So let's take a closer look at what gets created when a new team is instantiated in the admin center. So I'm the admin, right? And I go and I create a new sparkly Microsoft team. So along with that team, what happens sort of under the hood is we get a new Microsoft 365 group to manage the membership of that team. There is a SharePoint online site and this SharePoint document library where we store the files that people will be collaborating on in that team. Then there is an Exchange online shared mailbox. There is various ties into Microsoft 365 apps like Power BI. And there is a OneNote notebook as well as the calendar. So this kind of gives you an idea of, when we think about a Teams migration project, it's really important to understand that with this many moving parts, it would most likely be more complex than what it looks like on the surface. So from what we see here at Quest, Teams migrations are only gaining the momentum. With this, the numbers that we just seen in terms of the usage of Teams across the globe, the fact that Teams are used by most organizations, it basically means that Teams migrations are here to stay. Now, the most common scenarios for team migrations that we see is things like mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, right? That's for tenant-to-tenant migrations. Then there are some companies, quite a few actually, that outgrow the current enterprise content solutions that they have in place, like Google Suite, Box, Dropbox, and turn to Teams for the enterprise features. Another very common scenario is digital transformation, where companies moving from that old school model of having the on-premise infrastructure and moving everything into the cloud for the ease of management. Long story short, the Teams migrations are here to stay, and very likely things will need to be moved from either one team to the other, between the workloads, or even between the tenants. Now, the first step that we would like to offer for you guys' consideration is basically knowing what's in your source environment, right? Because there's so many variables in this equation. Pretty much every migration project should start the same, right? With the steps, with discovering what's on the source. Now let's set Teams aside for a second, and I just, like a real life example. So I was living in Boston a couple of years ago in a city apartment, and then the pandemic hit, and we just had our first baby. So we decided to move and embrace the suburban living. So when we were thinking about how do we approach this move, right? There are certain things that we needed to plan for and to know, right? How much stuff do we even have? It looks minimalistic, but we ended up with much more than we thought. How many boxes do I need to go and buy at Home Depot? When am I going to do this, right? Am I going to do it on a weekday to get the cheaper rate? Am I going to do it on the weekend to get the help from my friends? On that note, we needed to book a moving company, a reliable partner in that. And then, strategy-wise, do we move everything as is and then see how it fits and then get rid of stuff when we're already there? Or do we get rid of stuff that we are clearly not using right here and right now? Or will my husband's grand piano even fit through the staircase, right? So those are the things that we were considering, right? And you guys can probably tell what I'm getting at. It's not very different for when we run a Teams migration project. Things that I'm looking for are very similar, sort of from just a common sense perspective. How many teams are provisioned and how many of those are actively used? That's important, right? Because team sprawl is real. How much content lives in the team's workload? How many files do I have? How much SharePoint content am I going to be moving along with the Teams features? Then, how many channels do I have? Standard, private, shared? Do I have a lot of conversations in some of those? Do I have planner with tasks that I would need to be moving as well? And then will I be merging everything, moving everything as is, or maybe I want to merge some teams or leave some stuff behind. And then that's
it's over to me.
Randy.
So thanks, Sophia. And that was a lot of planning information. So clearly there's a lot that we need to know about Microsoft Teams to plan a migration. So personally, I'm a big fan of phased migrations, but I've also seen a lot of successful big bang migrations too. So in either scenario, there is a lot of planning. And I usually see customers and partners stage the content in advance of a cutover weekend. Uh, and that includes content from OneDrive, SharePoint, mail, messages, etc. But this does require a lot of planning activities. So let's go to the next slide. So I have a simple migration plan here that I'm going to go through with you. I found that over the years, these plans don't change significantly. The major tasks and order usually stay the same with any content migration project. It's the details that change, and the latter is what I'm going to try to speak more about. So first off, it's important to identify the key stakeholders. These people either own the project or are significantly impacted by it. Second is defining the scope helps you to avoid scope creep. This is challenging in a Teams migration since Teams content is rather sprawling. Next, so Sophia already talked about knowing your environment, or what we would call a pre-migration assessment. And there are SharePoint customizations to deal with that appear in subsites, libraries, and lists, and we're going to talk more about those too. Next is creating a test plan will help you to be consistent in what is being validated and tested during the migration. Otherwise, you may miss performing important tests, or you may continuously increase your testing with little or no value. Another way to look at this is test everything so that you can resume normal operations once you finish your move over to the target tenant. Next, a training plan will help your users adjust to the new tenant or environment. It should help to reduce calls to the help desk. And then I'm going to be talking more about a communication plan shortly. And then next is you will have to determine which content is migrated first. And I'll be speaking about this across a few different topics. And then I think everyone knows that you need a migration schedule. I won't get into the details of creating the schedule itself, but I hope to give you some guidance and make you aware of some problem areas. So one concern I have is that schedules are often based on the size of the data. So people will say, like, how fast can you migrate content, like how many gigabyte, per hour, and so on. But they don't really ask about the quantity of data or the versions and permissions. And I think is actually often more important and something you need to consider. Then I really encourage pilot or test migrations. You may have some complex content that needs to be migrated. Test it before starting your migration. For example, you may have 10,000 members in each team. Membership and permissions take a lot more time to migrate than most people realize. Then next, Sophia will speak more about preparing the target, and then I'll be speaking more about migrations. And then at the end, we'll cover more on validation.
So speaking of preparing the target, one of the things that may seem very trivial to a lot of people, but nonetheless, I want to make sure we cover it, right? Because the preparation can help saving time, maximizing the timeline of the migration, let alone saving your nerve cells, because you don't have to be reactive, right? You can just perform a set of actions to set yourself up for success while you have time to do it, instead of doing it as you go, right? And that would improve the outcome for sure. So things that I think are important to keep in mind, right, when you're moving teams are migration accounts with the prerequisites that are required, right? So you would need an account to read the data from the source tenant and to write the data into the target tenant. And that comes with a certain level of permission that would require. So obtaining those accounts, right, would basically guarantee that you are able to read the content, write it into the target. Then you need to make sure that end user accounts, first of all, exist, right? So we either create them or migrate them, depending on the scenario. And then you need to obtain the licenses for those accounts to have access to the Teams and OneDrive workloads, because Teams stores some of the content in the user's OneDrives, right? So we need to make sure those are accessible. And on that note, there's another step that needs to be taken, which is syncing OneDrives at least once prior to the migration. And then, very important point, provisioning Teams on the target. The thing with Teams is it takes a while to provision certain elements of the team, which makes it basically, it takes a while to provision the team, especially if there's shared channels, private channels. So that could take up to 24 hours to provision. And that basically means that you need to do it in advance, at least 24 hours prior to kicking off the migration.
So there are several limitations to consider when migrating, and here are some of the top ones that we've seen. There's wiki pages, shared channels into GCC High, education tenants, site home pages and web part configurations, and channel tabs for files that aren't migrated yet. So I'm going to look into a little more detail on some of these. So wiki pages, I like to think that these were designed by some ex-developers from IBM Notes. The XML for a Notes database was really cryptic and complex, and that's like what these wiki pages are like. They're really difficult to migrate. So it's probably good that they're removed and replaced with OneNote. So as far as I know, like this month, wiki pages won't be supported anymore. I think you can keep and edit what you have for a little while, and then I think editing will be turned off. So you can't do new wikis in Teams channels. And Microsoft does have a solution to export the wiki tab to a OneNote page. And what it is in a standard channel, you convert the wiki tab to a OneNote, but you have to do these one by one. There's no mass export that you can do. And I just show a little bit of information here, like on the bottom right, on how to do it. And then I have a link in that's shared in the channel too on where to go to get more information on this. Let's go to the next tab or the next slide. And after conversion, you'll have a OneNote document in your channel. And again, this happening this month, and then neither the wiki tabs or the wiki app will really be accessible through Teams. So I think that's rolling out. So if you've seen it already, then I think this is good news. Let's go to the next slide. So at one time, private channels were not supported in GCC High, and now it looks like they are supported. Thus, you should be able to migrate them. But shared channels are not supported in GCC High tenants. So if you're working in that environment, you probably can't create a shared channel. And this is probably because you don't want to give external access in Teams channels in the GCC High tenant, and you don't really want to share channels between teams. So users in GCC High will be able to only share with other organizations in GCC High. External sharing is available for GCC environments, but not for GCC High environments. So one of the challenges here is if you're moving from your basic teams going or basic tenant and you're going up to GCC and GCC High, you do have some limits, and that's basically the shared channels into GCC High. Next slide. Education tenants, I do get some questions about this every so often. They're only partially supported for migration, and some Teams content types are supported, like standard, class, PLC, and staff teams. Provisioning the private teams is supported. Let's go to the next slide. So the challenges with what is not supported here, and that is some assignments data cannot be migrated because it is not stored in SharePoint. The Microsoft documentation states that this content is stored outside of SharePoint document libraries, but doesn't really specify where it is. So I suspect it's like in Azure, maybe in an education data lake, but it's just not really clear. It looks like some of this data can be exported, but we're not really sure. But it doesn't look like it can be easily imported either. And this is like one of the biggest issues about it. So So this data is listed on the slide here. Thus, there is no method to move this education content between tenants. And And lastly, provisioning public teams is not supported. So let's go to the next slide. It's back to you.
Yep. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the SharePoint workload that we've seen that slide with the iceberg, right? When we create a team, there's a SharePoint site that gets created along with it. So we generally do support those migrations, no problem, right? It's just SharePoint. So, we would move the sites and pages just fine as a part of the team's migration. There's a little bit of a difference between how it started, right? When the teams were just rolled out, it was kind of designed to have that SharePoint site sitting in the back end, right? It's a simple, plain vanilla SharePoint site. It's used to store the files in a default document library that also gets created along with this site. And then users are accessing those files through the user interface of the team from the Files tab, right? So that was pretty simple. But then as users and admins were getting more familiar with Teams as a workload, this happened, right? So people started sort of using that SharePoint site, not just from the team, but also as a SharePoint site, as they used to, right? When SharePoint was the main collaboration workload. We started seeing more customizations of those sites. They started being branded with the corporate colors. Now there's some apps or web parts on them. There's some additional lists and libraries that get created for other types of content. And then, of course, subsites, right? If nothing prevents you from creating a subsite or 10 from that default SharePoint site behind the team. And then, of course, if there's a bunch of new content in there, then the permissions may change, right? There could be item level permissions, folder level permissions that are the inheritance is broken. So long story short, things got more complex when we're talking about moving those, right? Because now we have to keep those things in mind. Do we have any SharePoint sites that are not, the simple ones that have customizations, that have web parts or apps, right? Because now I need to make sure that on the target tenant, I need to go and check if those same things are activated and available for me to be able to move those, right? And I'm also looking at some probably cleanup / recreation of functionality, depending on what it was and what kind of customization that was. And then, the amount of content can become a factor because, not again, it's SharePoint. Nothing prevents you from going and uploading terabytes of data in there, right? Depth of sites. There are some administrators that are big fans of, nested sites within nested sites. So that can also pose a potential challenge, right? Because you need to make sure all of it gets migrated, and then the permission model has to be retained. So, this picture kind of describes that it used to be simpler. Now it's gotten a little bit more complex as people are getting more familiar and comfortable with Teams and all the bits and pieces that Teams are comprised of.
So I really like that image with the straight line versus the tangled line. I think it really helps to explain Teams migration planning. So I just want to briefly talk about channel tabs. So the challenge here is, what if a file in a channel tab is not migrated yet? And that can happen. It's like one of two ways. One is you haven't migrated the SharePoint content yet, or that content, that specific file, is actually in a different team. So Teams at that point, when you're doing the content migration, it won't allow you to create the tab if the file isn't already in place. So it basically looks like content is missing, might appear to someone as an error, but really it's just not migrated yet, so you can't create the tab. So what we really need here is some kind of post-processing step in Teams migration to deal with incremental content. Or you basically need to migrate all this content ahead of time. Also, this adding in a tab is, as far as I know, doing it from a file in OneDrive or directly in SharePoint doesn't work. So let's go to the next slide.
So with all that being said, right, that the messages would look different, tabs may be missing. It's really important to set the expectations of the users, because the end users tend to be kind of oblivious to the migration projects or projects in general that IT is doing. Everyone sort of expects this type of thing where, you know, I had my team and I was using it. Now you're telling me it's going to be migrated somewhere. I'm expecting to access it and just use it the way I used to on Friday. I'm going to do it on Monday. So, you know, with what we just talked about, when Brandy gave us some visual representation of how things can shift and things can be missing, the messages don't look quite the same. There may not be a tab where it used to be, right? So just to kind of let the users know, right, that things may look different than what they used to see. And making sure that they're aware that some changes are possible would, again, minimize the workload for the support team, where people would be like, hey, my team is broken. There was a tab here, now it's not there. So we think it's really important. It's a really important step that sometimes is overlooked, to make sure that your end users are aware of the implications and the limitations that we currently have with the team's workload and the migrations around it.
So I'm going to talk a little more about communication planning, but I love that picture of the Olaf cake every time I see it. So I think it's just awesome. So one of the reasons I focused on communication planning is because of issues that appear when migrating private chat. They don't, the content and structure doesn't exactly look the same like it did on the source when you bring it over to the target. And that one of the main reasons is because you can't impersonate the user who originally created the message. So because of that, we often tell people, make sure you communicate this to the users as to what the differences are. And so I'm a big believer in using communication plans. There can be a lot of assumptions made about who is communicating and what is being communicated. But many years ago, I spoke to several IT managers about some large projects that they had managed. The number one reason they gave for a project failure or delay was poor communication with users. Employees often said, no one told us, or we heard about this once and never again. So as a result, it's like I'm a big believer in communicating this. So especially like when it comes to chat migrations. Let's go to the next slide. And so this slide just kind of shows kind of briefly what a topic should contain, like what's this topic of this communication, who the audience is. I recommend having some sample messages in here and trying to automate it as much as possible. Maybe there's some templates or official messages in your organization. And then the method of communication, whether that's an email or some other means. Describe the objective of that communication, like why is it important, what is it meant to accomplish, and how frequently should the message be sent, like one time, daily, weekly, or multiple times. And then finally, who owns or is responsible for managing the message. Let's go to the next slide. So talking a little bit more about chat migrations, we're going to get into a little more details here. I got a few topics to cover. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the biggest challenges is trying to understand just how many messages you really have. And I'm only talking like private chat messages here, like not channel messages. It's like measuring the length of the string. You don't really know how long it is until you get to the end. But there are some reports that you can run in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. Here's like just some images of it. There is a limit on how many days you can select. So it's 730, 90, or 180, but you can't choose all the days. But a good thing is you can actually export this out to Excel and then review it in a little more detail. And I wrote a blog post on this too. So next is on the next slide. There's another report that you can use. It's a Power BI report. You have to enable usage analytics to have this report and have a Power BI Pro license, but it's a very helpful report. Again, I have a blog post that talks about this in a lot more detail, and it does collect a lot of data, but you want to start this earlier rather than later. So if you want to use it for some planning purposes, you want to start collecting data as early as possible, but there's a lot of good data in it. And then next slide is you can also use PowerShell to get this information. So There's a couple of methods here. The first method can only return the number of messages based on number of days, similar to the couple of slides ago. The second method can actually return the total count of messages, but in either case, these methods require deduplication. So what that means is the same unique message in a thread is counted for each user, but it only gets migrated once. So for example, if I have a message thread going with Sophia and there's 100 messages in there, when you count it up, it looks like there's 100 messages for Sophia and 100 messages for me, but there's only 100 unique messages. So that's one of the challenges with trying to determine just how many messages you have. It's really, you can't tell how many unique messages there are until you actually do the whole migration. In addition, both of these PowerShell commands are rather slow to run. Next slide. So another question I get, and I had it again this week, is can you migrate chat messages faster? So it's kind of like yes and no. There is a Graph API. It's free, but it's slow. There is an export API that you can use. It's very fast at reading the structure of messages. It doesn't do as well at reading like the content. Like we find the Graph API gives you like more of the content that's actually in the message, so it's better to use that. But the export API reads that structure like 10 times faster than the Graph API, and that does make a pretty good performance difference. Like we've seen it like up to 4 times faster for doing a migration, just getting all the unique messages rapidly. But the downside is for a small number of messages, like if you're just going to do the under 30 days, there really isn't a significant performance difference between the export API and the Graph API. You still have to read the entire structure just to get the last 30 days of messages. In addition, it's like export API is not free, so you do have to pay to use it. So other options you have to migrate faster is just merge messages on the target for performance gains. We do find that works a lot better. And I do have some like numbers down at the bottom of this chart. So it shows Graph API can do about 20 requests per second, and the export API can do about 200 requests per second. So, you know, you might think it's about 10 times faster, but again, you just really want to use export API for reading the structure fast, but you will have to pay for it, and it is expensive. But it does help. So that hopefully, if you have more questions about that, let me know. I do see a question. I'll get to that one a little bit later too. So next slide is about look and feel here. So again, there's some challenges with migrating the messages in that you can't impersonate the user. So the messages are created with the account that you're using for the migration. What we do is, and we recommend this, is just merge the messages together when you're migrating them over to the target. It is a little bit faster. You don't get slowed down so much, and really you want every performance gain that you can get. Even if you use this approach, and you have to use a migration account, the order of those messages should be in the correct order. So then if you come in and add more messages later, these ones will just be bumped up. Next slide, please. I think it's back to you, Sophia.
Correct. So private and shared channels, we mentioned those a couple of times in the context of provisioning, but I want to take a step back and just sort of circle back and see what the differences are between those, right? Standard channels are available to all team members and teams, and most channels are standard channels, which is a good thing. If you need a smaller specific audience for a particular subject, that's when you go and create a private channel. And then shared channels are for collaborating with people inside and outside your team organization. So private and shared channels can pose some unique migration challenges. The thing with shared channel is, you share them across teams or even across tenants, which is really cool. And that's what teams are good for, right? Collaboration and being flexible. But of course, it comes with some caveats when we talk migrations. We can provision that shared channel and migrate the content from the original shared channel to the target shared channel, but only do one. So we cannot recreate that shared channel in another team even if it's internal. So we can just migrate the content of the original team and move it over. And then we already mentioned potential delay provisioning. We're going to talk about it again because it really holds up the process of the migration, right? For private and shared channels can take a long time to provision. There's a SharePoint site that gets created on the back end. There's permissions. So all of that is contributing to the problem, right? Or I shouldn't call it problem, it's a challenge, right? Because you would need to account for that additional time to provision those. For private channels, they're simpler than shared channels because they only live in that one place, in that one team. However, the issues lie in the privacy and security settings, right? Because we're using this type of channel for like narrow audience. So we go and we tweak the security for it. And that's what would be an additional thing to check for and to sort of watch out for during your migrations. So yeah, those are the two challenges that we see with private and shared channels that we wanted to cover. And that's back to you, Randy.
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about finalizing the order of migration. So we used to see a lot of migration just by team. So people would basically select the teams, like say 25 of them, and migrate them all at once, and everything would be migrated over. But as we got into like larger projects, we'd see hundreds of teams, sometimes thousands of teams. And a lot of customers were trying to migrate the content more in stages or phases rather than just doing each one individually. So, in effect, they were staging the content in advance and then coming back and doing the remainder of the team's components. So let's go to the next slide and I'll explain it a little bit more. So here I'm going to break down a little bit more if you go migrating by type of content. And I'll skip through the first four, which are user accounts, match users and groups, migrate email, migrate OneDrive. We'll assume that those got done. And we'll get into provisioning teams. And Sophia talked about this a bit already about you really want to provision 24 hours in advance, not 1 hour, because we do see that from time to time. And shared channels and private channels, they don't always get provisioned in 1 hour. So you're better off waiting 24. 6 is migrating SharePoint, and Sophia really explained this well. There's a lot of staging of SharePoint content in advance of any Teams migration. It's a good idea to get this done because you really want to have this content in place. Also, we do see a lot of custom content now, which Sophia again explained very well. We also see extraordinarily huge lists and libraries that also need to be migrated, and they can take quite a bit of time to migrate. 7 is migrating the group email, and this refers to the Microsoft 365 group mailbox that includes mail and calendaring. And I think that the team meeting in the channel that has to be recreated, or like Teams meeting in channels. But I will say I'm not an expert in mail and calendaring, but that's something that we see quite a bit of. And then migrating channels and messages. So Sophia covered private and shared channels already. I talked about creating the tabs in the channels, making sure that that content is in place already. It's the channel messages that can sometimes take a lot longer than expected. And we've seen some customers have like 10,000 messages or even 100,000 messages in a channel, just an extraordinarily huge number. And there is a kind of a throughput capacity limit on reading and writing for messages. And you'll see sometimes that a team can take a long time to migrate when it has so many messages in there. If it's like 100, it really will just get done very quick. But that is one of the big blockers there for getting teams done quickly. And you'd think it would be fast because it just seems like it's text, but it's actually very slow. So you can also migrate the SharePoint content just before the channel migration. Again, like staging ahead of time is really important. For planner migration, up until recently, this was a big concern because there was like this 20,000 planner task limit that we always face. So if you had more than 20,000 tasks in one or more plans, you'd have to switch accounts. But now we, like in our own solution, there is a way to get around this limit, so you can get over 20,000. I think the only catch is that you're going to see that the application manager or the migration account you're using is going to be the task creator. And then next is rediscover and reprovision. So this does come up quite a bit if you're staging ahead of time. If you're still letting your users who are using Teams go in and create new channels, especially any shared channels or private channels, you need to go back, discover that again, and reprovision those channels again. And you may have to wait 24 hours again. So if you're looking at restarting this on a Friday evening and you haven't gone and rediscovered and reprovisioned, you may be delayed. And so that's, again, that's one reason, going back to the communication plan, why we often say is send out some communication to your users. Tell them don't create new channels or new teams during the migration process, and just inform them of this. And then you get to avoid this potential 24-hour delay. And then next is incremental migrations. So we do see this being used more and more often. Content gets staged during the week, incremental migration on a cutover weekend. I do always want to point out, don't stage more than 60 days in advance and then say, okay, day 61, let's do the incremental migration. There's a change token that gets used because of the APIs that we're using. That token expires after 60 days, and then we no longer have a reference point to say like, oh, this is the last time a migration was done. So you want to run incremental migrations before 60 days. Then migrating membership, basically last step to complete on the target tenant, set who can access the team. Often we recommend wait until the end so that the membership is set up correctly. Because users keep making changes on the source, goes back to the communication plan. The challenge is if you have users working in both the source and the target at the same time, and it's like in the same kind of teams, do you want to migrate the membership at the beginning and then update it again later? So that can be an issue. The other one I think I mentioned just briefly is like you have 10,000 members in a team. It can take a long time to migrate like 10,000 members. Anything with permissions takes a lot longer than anyone expects. And Teams membership migration gets heavily throttled. And if I haven't said it yet, we'd have no control over throttling. And last is archiving the source team. This seems more popular now. It's basically set the team to be in an archive state on the source. That will prevent users from adding more content. We also see a lot of customers and partners who want to migrate archived teams from the source to the target tenant too.
Perfect. Thank you, Randy. So sort of one of the last things that we wanted to bring out to your attention is again, sort of the expectation of the users kind of coming into play during the course of migration, where the users are wanting to be able to access their old team on the source and then already starting to work on the target team if they have access to it. So with large enterprise team migrations, those often impact thousands of users. And it's not possible to start and finish the migration over a single weekend. So what we see is, users working in the source and the target once it's already migrated, right? That the content is migrated into the target. So the challenge is users may want the same content to be available to them, right, in both places, and they're making changes in both places. So there is no magic solution here, right? For the sake of the people that are running the migration, it's probably better to, if possible, to just prevent this whole thing from happening and have the users work only in the target after the migration completes, right? Not make any changes to the source. Again, in real world, it does happen a lot when the users keep using both source and target. And because Teams is a collaboration platform, right? If they're sharing any content that came from their OneDrive for Business, or they're adding it into the Teams meeting, or maybe they went and they uploaded a new file, you're looking at quite a few incremental migrations of different workloads here. So it can get really messy quickly. And if it's not possible to stop the users from working in both, you may have to migrate that content incrementally and then make the copies of the content and then just have the users merge or do with those versions that they created, whatever they think is best. And then channel conversations are even more complicated and messier, so it's probably better not to keep updating those on the target at all. So here it's better to prevent than to remediate, but if you don't have a choice, those are sort of the options that we can suggest here. And then number 10, post-migration validation, right? We go through the project, the migration completes. How do we validate the results? So first of all, right, most likely you would be using a solution for that would have the log files, that would collect all the information about what was copied, what was skipped, and if there are any errors, which most likely you will see at least a few. So we would want to review those logs and make sure that we're aware of everything that those logs are telling us. If there's anything I need to remigrate, if there's anything I need to be aware of that it didn't get migrated because there's a limitation from the API standpoint or anything like that. I want to be aware of that stuff. Then we can go and compare Teams matrix before and after the migration. It would work for the forklift types of migrations really well, right? Because the numbers should add up. But if you're filtering out content, if you're merging teams, that's when it gets a little bit trickier. Still a good reference point, right? Just see if the math adds up. And then, of course, we want real people to go and log into those teams that they created and that they were a part of, and make sure that it's just they're functional, everything they're looking for is there, even if it looks slightly different. And then, just get the validation from a real group of users, do the user acceptance testing, make sure everything is there and functional. If we wanted to get a little bit more practical and go through like the actual things to look for, we would check for team name, channel names, number of conversations and content, number of files, and that all the versions are there, right? If there were any additional SharePoint sites, we would want to make sure that those got migrated as well. And then the planner plans and tasks, we want to make sure that those moved over without a problem. That's back to you, Randy.
Yeah, so we covered a lot in this session. There's probably more that we could cover, but we tried to squeeze everything in that we could. This slide here is just like a checklist of everything that we covered, of all the 10 main points that we have. I think we'll be able to share this out with everyone, or you can just take a screenshot of it now. But it's just meant to give you like a quick overview of everything that we covered here, and give you a checklist too. So with that, let's go over to Q&A and see if we have any questions. So I do see one question about webhooks configured by admin, and I'm going to assume that's like, can those be migrated? I mean, it's an interesting question. It is something we looked at quite a while back. We didn't see too much demand for it at the time, so I'm always interested in hearing like if customers and partners need more like capabilities in their Teams migration. So if that's something that you're seeing more of, like please let us know. I don't think it's currently supported at this time. I don't know if it's possible to do it either. I know we looked at it like 2-3 years ago or so, and I didn't think it was possible to migrate those over. Plus, I think you have to configure them over on the target tenant in advance, and that's something I'm pretty sure we wouldn't be able to do. So I'm hopefully that kind of answers your question. Like I don't think it's possible at this time, but definitely want to hear more if that or anything else is in demand. Okay. I think Caesar has his hands up. I don't know if we can switch to voice and let people ask a question, or if not, just go ahead and post. So Caesar, are you able to post your question in chat, and then we can respond to it? And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask at any time, or like even in the chat afterwards, and we'll try to get back to you. If not, then why don't we go to the next slide and let Dan cover that topic?
Yeah, great. Well, hey, Randy, Sophia, thank you for the fantastic presentation, and thanks for everyone for posting a couple questions in. Just wanted to call out a couple things that are coming up. So thanks for joining, first of all, today's virtual Tech Talk. If you want more tech content in person with more access to speakers and the experts like Sophia and Randy and others, we have a range of MVPs and Microsoft employees at the live tech conference. The next one being Tech 2024 in Dallas, Texas, October 1st and 2nd. It's a great opportunity to get more intimate access to all the presenters, MVPs, and experts, as well as a great networking opportunity for your peers. And if you're sick of being stuck on virtual meetings, it's a great opportunity to get out of the office as well. So registration is open. So if you want to take advantage of your travel budgets early, you can go to theexpertsconference.com and register today. You can pass it off to your colleagues as well if you have a team of people that you want to bring, which is a very popular option for many of our customers that have attended. If you ask anyone who attended the Atlanta conference last year, it was incredible, and I'm sure their testimony would be similar to that. So again, theexpertsconference.com will take you there, and Katie just put that link, the direct link, in the chat. So thank you for Katie for that. In our next Tech Talk, Sophia, if we want to go to the next slide, our next Tech Talk session is actually this coming Thursday, same time, 11 a.m. Eastern. You can see the chat for the link to that as well. And if you already registered, you probably have something on the calendar. So Thursday session is going to also be around tenant to tenant migrations, but this time focusing on the Power BI workload. So tenant migrations, Power BI, the next frontier. Sean Visser and Gary Hughes from Quest will be your presenters for that one. So that wraps up today's session. Thanks everyone. Thanks Randy and Sophia and Katie and Craig and Steve on the back end. And thanks all of you for joining. We hope you have a great rest of your day and week.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.